I know what you're thinking. How could I? How could anyone? But trust me when I say that no one is more shocked than I am at how my life unraveled. If you stay until the end, maybe you'll understand, or maybe you'll hate me even more. Either way, this is my story. When I married David, I thought I knew everything about love. He was kind, dependable, and everything a girl could ask for. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes everything isn't enough. The spark, the passion, the thrill, those things can fade, leaving you with a hollow routine that feels more like a partnership than a marriage. Enter Richard, David's father. A man I had always respected, admired, and admittedly found a little intimidating. He had this presence about him, confident, commanding, and unapologetically himself. Every family gathering, every casual conversation, every subtle glance. It all seemed so innocent until it wasn't. It started small. Richard would compliment my cooking, my dress, or the way I handled myself during heated family debates. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, he was just being polite, right? But as time went on, his words felt different, more personal, more intentional. One evening, while David was working late, Richard stopped by unexpectedly. He claimed he was just dropping off a tool David had left at his house, but the way he lingered in the doorway told me otherwise. I invited him in for coffee, and before I knew it, we were sitting in the living room talking for hours. Richard wasn't like David. Where David was cautious and reserved, Richard was bold and unfiltered. He spoke his mind, even when it wasn't pretty. And as much as I hated to admit it, I found it refreshing. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Like someone actually cared about what I had to say. That night, as he left, he touched my hand, just briefly, but long enough to send a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it, but deep down I knew better. The next time I saw him, it was at a family barbecue. Surrounded by laughter and chatter, we stole glances at each other across the yard. Every look felt like a secret, a spark igniting a fire neither of us dared to acknowledge. But when he found me alone in the kitchen, the tension became unbearable. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low and steady. I tried to play it off, to laugh and change the subject, but he stepped closer, his eyes locked onto mine. "Tell me I'm imagining it," he whispered. "Tell me you don't feel it too." In that moment, I could have walked away. I could have shut it down, set boundaries, and pretended this was all in my head. But instead, I stood there, frozen, as he leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was everything I hadn't realized I was craving. It was passionate, urgent, and completely wrong. And yet, I didn't pull away. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Like I wasn't just going through the motions of life, but actually living it. What followed was a whirlwind of stolen moments and hidden truths. Richard and I found excuses to see each other. A quick trip to the hardware store, a shared bottle of wine after family dinners, late-night texts that grew increasingly bold. Each time I told myself it would be the last, that I'd come to my senses and put an end to it. But each time, I found myself falling deeper into the web we were weaving. The guilt was unbearable. Every time I looked at David, I felt like a monster. He didn't deserve this. He deserved someone who loved him wholeheartedly, without hesitation or doubt. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop. Richard had awakened something in me that I couldn't ignore. The breaking point came during a family vacation. David had planned a weekend getaway to the mountains, hoping to rekindle our spark. Richard came along, of course, as he often did, and while David was busy organizing activities, Richard and I found ourselves alone on a hiking trail. The air was crisp, the forest eerily quiet, and the tension between us reached its peak. He stopped walking, turned to me, and said, "This can't go on." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "I know." But instead of walking away, we found ourselves in each other's arms, desperate and reckless. In that secluded moment, it felt like the world had stopped, like nothing else mattered but us. But reality came crashing back when we returned to the cabin and saw David's face. He had seen us, and the look in his eyes. It's something I'll never forget. Everything unraveled after that. David confronted me, demanding to know how long it had been going on. I tried to explain, to apologize, but there was no justification for what I had done. Richard admitted everything, taking full responsibility, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. David left that night, and I haven't seen him since. Richard and I tried to make things work, but the guilt and the judgment from others were too much to bear. We ended things shortly after, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my choices. Looking back, I can't say I regret it. Not entirely. Because in those fleeting moments with Richard, I found a part of myself I thought I had lost. A part that was wild, passionate, and unafraid. But I also lost so much more. My marriage, my family, and the man who had trusted me with his heart. So here I am, sharing my story with the world, hoping that someone out there can learn from my mistakes, or maybe, just maybe, find a little bit of understanding in their own complicated life. Because the truth is, love is messy, life is messy, and sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself.